The night was quiet, save for the rustling of the wind through the cottonwoods that bordered the small ranch. Inside the cabin, Mary sat by the dim fire, mending a shirt with weary fingers. It had been another long day tending to the animals and keeping her modest homestead alive. Widowhood had taught her silence, patience, and resilience, but even so, there were nights when the loneliness pressed down so heavily that she thought she might suffocate beneath it. Just as she folded the shirt, a sound broke through the night, a knock, soft yet firm, at her door. Her heart jolted. No one ever came this late. Fear flickered in her chest. She blew out the lantern, grabbed the old rifle from beside the door, and crept toward the sound. "Who's there?" she called, her voice steady though her hands trembled slightly. There was no answer, only another knock, more urgent this time. Gathering courage, she slid the bar from the door and opened it a crack. Her breath caught. Standing there in the pale moonlight was an Apache warrior. His hair was long and dark, his face drawn with fatigue, his shoulders slumped as though he carried the weight of the world. In his arms, swaddled in a thin blanket, was a crying infant. The baby's wails pierced the night, weak yet desperate. Mary's instinct was to slam the door. Her people had always warned her of Apache's savages. They called them men who lived by the bow and knife. But something in the warrior's eyes stopped her. They weren't filled with hatred or threat. They were filled with raw desperation. "Milk," he rasped, his English broken but clear enough. "Please." "My son." Hungry. Mary froze, the rifle still clutched in her hands. She stared at the tiny child, his face scrunched in hunger, his lips rooting against the thin blanket. Her heart twisted. She had once known the sound of a baby's cry, her own infant, lost to fever 2 winters ago. The echo of that memory hit her like a blow. The warrior shifted, as if ready to fall to his knees. "No food. No woman. Die." His voice cracked, betraying the pain of a man who had already lost too much. Against every warning, every story she had been told, Mary lowered the rifle. Slowly, she opened the door wider. "Come in," she whispered. The warrior hesitated, then stepped inside with the baby cradled against his chest. His movements were careful, almost reverent, as though he knew one wrong step could cost him this fragile moment of trust. Mary took the child into her arms. The warmth of his tiny body, the trembling breath against her neck, stirred something deep within her, something she thought had died with her own child. Without another word, she sat in the rocking chair by the fire, unfastened her bodice and guided the infant to her breast. The baby latched on hungrily, his cries quieting into small, desperate gulps. Relief washed over her as she felt the rhythm of his feeding. She rocked gently, humming a lullaby she hadn't sung in years. The warrior stood silently, watching with a mixture of exhaustion and awe. His face softened, the hardness in his jaw easing as though seeing his child nourished was enough to mend his own soul. For a moment, they didn't seem like enemies from 2 different worlds. They were simply 2 broken people bound by the life of a child. When the baby finally drifted into sleep, Mary looked up at the warrior. His dark eyes glistened with gratitude he couldn't put into words. She didn't need them. She understood. That night, with a single knock, her quiet, lonely world had shifted. She didn't yet know it, but the moment she nursed that child, she had stepped into a story that would bind her life to theirs forever. The next morning, Mary awoke to the sound of birdsong and the faint creak of her rocking chair. For a moment, she thought she had dreamed it all: the knock, the baby, the Apache warrior standing in her doorway. But then she turned her head. The cradle she had not touched in years, the one she kept tucked away in a corner as a painful reminder of what she had lost, now held a sleeping baby. His small chest rose and fell with steady breaths. And near the door, crouched like a sentinel, sat the Apache warrior. His back pressed against the wall, his eyes half closed, yet alert even in rest. Mary's heart thudded. She should have been afraid. She should have ordered him gone before anyone saw him here. Yet instead, she only felt curious and strangely safe. She busied herself with the morning chores, feeding the chickens, milking the cow, but when she came back inside, she found him still there, watching his child with a tenderness she did not expect from a man raised in war. At last, she broke the silence. "Your wife," she said softly, her hands tightening on her apron. "She is gone, isn't she?" The warrior lifted his head. His eyes met hers, and for the first time, she saw not just desperation, but grief so heavy it seemed to bow his very soul. "Yes," he said, his voice low and halting. "She died. When boy come," he gestured toward the sleeping infant. His words were simple, broken, but Mary understood well enough. His wife had died giving birth. Her throat tightened. She knew that kind of loss, the kind that ripped a piece of you away and left you with an emptiness no words could fill. She was strong, he continued after a long pause. His gaze drifted to the fire, as if he could see his wife's face in the flames. Strong woman. Brave heart. She fight? But spirit take her. He touched his chest, then the baby's, then looked at Mary. Now, only him. "Only my son," the baby stirred, letting out a soft cry. Mary moved instinctively, lifting him into her arms and settling into the rocker once more. She held him close, whispering soothing words as he latched and began to feed again. The warrior watched in silence, his face unreadable. But when the baby's cries softened and he curled against Mary with contentment, something shifted in his expression. His eyes glistened with a mixture of relief and sorrow, and perhaps something else, a deep gratitude that he could not speak aloud. Mary's heart tugged painfully. This child, motherless and fragile, had been carried across wilderness and hunger by a father desperate enough to beg for help at the door of a patada, woman who should have been his enemy. She realized then just how far he must have fallen, for warriors were proud men. To come begging for milk was not an act of weakness, it was an act of love. "Does he have a name?" Mary asked gently, breaking the quiet. The warrior hesitated, then nodded. "Dakota," he said finally, his accent giving the word a rhythm unfamiliar to her ears. "It means friend to all." Mary repeated it softly, as if testing the shape of it on her tongue. "Dakota." The baby shifted in her arms, almost as if he recognized his name. The warrior's lips curved into the faintest of smiles, brief and fleeting. But in that smile, Mary saw the man behind the hardened exterior, a father clinging to hope, a man still mourning, yet determined to keep his child alive. As the morning sun poured through the small window, Mary realized that what had begun as a single night's mercy was not going to end there. The warrior would return. He had to. His son's survival depended on it. And deep in her heart, though she would not yet admit it aloud, she wanted him to. The days that followed slipped into an unusual rhythm. Mary found herself listening each evening for the faint shuffle of footsteps outside her door, her heart leaping at the soft knock that always came once night had settled. Each time she opened the door, the Apache warrior stood there tall, silent, holding his child close to his chest. He never lingered on the threshold. His eyes darted about, wary of being seen. But once inside, he seemed to breathe easier, as if her cabin had become a sanctuary he hadn't dared hope for. Mary, too, felt the odd comfort of his presence. The loneliness that had clung to her since her husband's passing seemed to ease a little with each visit. The baby, Dakota, grew stronger in those nights of feeding. His cries were less frantic, his skin less pale. He began to curl his tiny fingers around Mary's blouse as though he knew her already. And each time, when the child finally drifted into sleep, Mary would catch the warrior watching her with an expression she could not quite name, something between wonder and disbelief. One night, as she rocked Dakota, Mary decided to break the heavy silence. "He's thriving," she said softly. "Soon he'll be laughing, crawling, tugging at everything in reach." The warrior gave a small nod. "Good, strong." His voice was gruff, but she could hear the pride beneath it. Her hands brushed the baby's soft hair as she asked, "What will you do then? When he no longer needs milk?" He stiffened, the shadows of the fire playing across his features. "I take him home," he said at last, the words clipped and certain. "My people." His people. Mary's chest tightened. Of course. The boy belonged to the Apache, not to her. Yet, deep down, she couldn't ignore the ache at the thought of him leaving her arms forever. She had lost one child already. Could she bear to lose another? She forced a smile, hiding her thoughts. "Until then, I'll care for him as best I can." The warrior's gaze lingered on her a moment longer than usual. His jaw shifted as though he wanted to say more, but he remained silent. Instead, he rose, pacing toward the door. When he turned back, he set something on the table, a bundle wrapped in deer hide. "For you," he said simply. Mary frowned, unwrapping it. Inside lay a small pouch of dried berries, a polished bone comb, and a bracelet woven from bright beads. She looked up, startled. "You don't need to give me anything. I'm only doing what's right for the child." The warrior's face hardened, but not unkindly. "I pay respect, always." She studied him, realizing that for his people, gratitude was never spoken cheaply. Each gift was a piece of himself, an offering meant to honor her role in saving his son. She swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. "Then I will accept." But outside the safety of her cabin walls, the world was less forgiving. Already, neighbors had begun to notice odd things: strange tracks in the dirt, shadows moving past her windows, the faint cry of a baby no one knew she had. A rancher who lived a mile down the road had squinted at her that very morning when he saw her hanging. "Laundry. Strange sounds coming from your place at night," he had said with suspicion. Almost like an Indian, Mary had forced a laugh, brushing it off, but the knot of dread in her stomach hadn't left her since now. As she handed Dakota back to his father, she realized she was no longer afraid of the warrior himself. What frightened her was the world outside, the neighbors who wouldn't understand, the whispers that could turn into accusations. As the warrior slipped into the night, his figure melting into the shadows, Mary stood at the door for a long time, clutching the beaded bracelet to her chest. He was a stranger at her door, yes, but he was no longer a stranger to her heart. By the time autumn painted the prairie in golden rust, Mary's cabin no longer felt like the same place it had been when the Apache warrior first knocked at her door. The silence that had once pressed so heavily on her walls was now softened by the sounds of life: Dakota's small cries, his coos, and sometimes the low murmur of his father's voice in a tongue Mary did not understand. Each night the warrior came, and each night the child grew stronger. At first, their exchanges had been wordless, Mary offering her arms and her breast, the warrior hovering silently, his dark eyes fixed on his son. But as weeks stretched into months, words began to slip between them, fragile at first, then steadier. One evening, while Mary rocked the baby, she asked, "What do you call this lullaby?" She had noticed the warrior humming softly when Dakota fussed, the melody haunting yet gentle. The man tilted his head, listening to her attempt to mimic the tune. "It is Song of the Meadowlark," he said, his English rough but improving with each visit. "We sing to children. Tell them they belong to earth, to sky." Mary smiled faintly. "A lovely thought. I used to sing hymns to my boy." Her voice caught, and she looked down at Dakota, hiding the ache that still lived in her heart. The warrior's gaze lingered on her. He seemed to understand more than her words could express. After a long pause, he said, "You give my son peace of your heart." He tapped his chest, then gestured to her. "He feel it." The word struck her deeply. She looked at him, truly looked, and for the first time noticed the lines of sorrow carved into his face, the exhaustion beneath his stoic expression. He was not only a warrior, he was a grieving husband, a father desperate to keep his child alive. As the nights grew colder, Mary began setting aside a place for them near the fire. She would hand the warrior a cup of broth, insisting he take nourishment as well. At first he resisted, but eventually he accepted, bowing his head in gratitude. In return, he shared small pieces of his world, the names of stars in his language, the way to read animal tracks, the stories his people told of the mountains. Mary found herself listening with rapt attention, drawn to the richness of a life so different from her own. And he, in turn, listened to her stories of farm life, of her husband lost to fever, of the dreams she once had of a bustling household filled with laughter. Trust bloomed quietly, almost without notice. The warrior no longer lingered near the door, but would sit on the stool by the fire, his son cradled in his strong arms, while Mary mended or prepared herbs. Sometimes, when Dakota fussed, they both bent over him together, their hands brushing as they tried to soothe him. The accidental touches startled them at first, but gradually, they no longer pulled away so quickly. One evening, Dakota reached a tiny hand toward Mary's hair as she leaned close. The warrior chuckled softly, a sound so rare and surprising that it made her heart flutter. "You are his mother, too," he said, his voice quiet, almost reverent. The words left Mary breathless. She looked at the sleeping child in her arms, then at the man who had once been a stranger. Perhaps he was still a stranger to the world outside, but within these walls something fragile yet undeniable had taken root. But with every deepening bond came a shadow of fear. Mary knew the townsfolk would not understand. If they saw what she was becoming to this child and to his father, they would turn on her. Already, whispers rustled through the settlement. Still, as the warrior placed a beaded necklace in her hand that night, murmuring a word she didn't yet know, Mary felt something stir within her, belonging, connection, and perhaps even love, and though she didn't speak it aloud, she knew the truth. Their lives were no longer separate. They were entwined, bound by a child who carried both their hearts. The first snow of winter fell softly across the prairie, dusting the rooftops of the small settlement and blanketing the land in silence. Mary's cabin glowed warmly in the evenings, the fire inside flickering with life. Yet the peace she felt within her walls did not extend beyond them. Outside, whispers were spreading like wildfire. It began with tracks. A rancher named Jonas had ridden past her homestead and noticed unfamiliar prints in the snow. Boot prints, yes, but also moccasin prints, moving to and from her door. "Strange company you're keeping, Mary," he remarked with narrowed eyes when she passed him at the general store. "Better hope you ain't inviting trouble to your doorstep." Mary forced a polite smile and brushed past him, but her heart pounded all the way home. She knew how quickly suspicion could turn to accusation. Out here, folks needed little reason to brand someone a traitor, especially if the word Apache was whispered. That night, when the soft knock came, she hesitated before opening the door. Fear twisted in her gut. But then she heard Dakota's small whimper, and without another thought, she unbarred the door and ushered them inside. "You must be careful," she whispered urgently once the baby was in her arms. "People are beginning to notice. If they find out you've been coming here—" She trailed off, her throat tight. The warrior's face darkened, his eyes narrowing. "They hurt you?" "Not yet," Mary admitted. "But if they believe I'm helping an Apache, they'll turn on me. They'll say I've betrayed my own kind." For a long moment, silence hung heavy between them. The baby suckled quietly, unaware of the storm brewing beyond these walls. At last, the warrior stepped closer, his presence filling the small cabin. "I take him," he said firmly. "No more danger for you." Mary's heart lurched. She looked down at Dakota, his tiny hand clutching the fabric of her dress, his soft eyes fluttering closed. The thought of never holding him again, of losing the child who had filled her empty arms and heart, was unbearable. "No," she said, more sharply than she intended. She softened her voice, stroking the baby's hair. "He needs me. You know it. He cries for me. He feeds from me. If you take him now, he won't survive the winter." The warrior's jaw tightened, torn between fear for her safety and the truth in her words. His eyes softened as he looked at his son nestled against her. "You love him," he said quietly, not as a question but as a fact. Mary swallowed hard, her throat thick with unshed tears. "As if he were my own." The warrior nodded slowly, the tension in his body easing. He lowered himself onto the stool by the fire, his gaze fixed on the flames. "Then we fight together. If danger come, I protect." Her breath caught at the certainty in his voice. A part of her wanted to believe it, to let herself feel safe in his promise. But another part knew the truth. If the townsfolk discovered the bond forming between her and the Apache warrior, no blade or bow could shield her from their judgment. The following days brought more unease. Jonas returned, this time with sharper words. "Saw shadows moving in your cabin last night," he said with a knowing smirk. "Strange how you've got no kin, yet there's a man-shaped figure at your window. Folks are starting to wonder if you're hiding something." Mary's face burned, though she forced her voice to stay calm. "You do well not to spread tales without proof, Jonas." But she knew it was only a matter of time before rumors hardened into truth in the eyes of the settlement. That evening, when the knock came again, Mary opened the door without hesitation. She took the baby into her arms, holding him close, as if daring the world to see Dot. She knew danger was closing in. But she also knew this, no matter what the neighbors said. She would not turn her back on the warrior who trusted her, or the child who now felt like her very own. The tension in the settlement thickened with each passing day. Mary felt it in the way conversations hushed when she entered a room, in the sideways glances cast over barrels of flour at the general store, in the chill of neighbors' silence where once there had been small talk. The whispers had sharpened into suspicion, and suspicion into quiet hostility. It all came to a head one bitterly cold afternoon. Mary had gone into town for salt and kerosene when she found a small crowd gathered near the blacksmith shop. Their voices carried, and her heart sank when she heard her name. "She's been keeping company with an Apache," Jonas declared loudly, his arms folded across his chest, a sneer curling his lips. "I seen him slipping out of her place at night. And don't tell me I was mistaken." "Moccasin tracks don't lie," murmurs rippled through the group. A woman clutched her shawl tighter, whispering to her companion. Another man spat on the ground. Mary forced her voice steady as she stepped forward. "You've no proof of any such thing, Jonas. You're spreading lies because you've nothing better to do." Jonas smirked. "Lies? Then why's there a baby crying in your house some nights?" "You got no kinfolk, Mary. You tell us whose child it is." Her cheeks burned, her hands trembling as every pair of eyes fixed on her. She could feel the weight of judgment pressing down, demanding an answer she could not give. Before she could speak, old Mrs. Turner shook her head sadly. "Lord help us, it's true then. She's laying down with Indians." The words sliced through Mary like a blade. She turned on her heel, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing her tears, and hurried home with her parcels clutched tight to her chest. That evening, when the soft knock came, she opened the door quickly, relief flooding her at the sight of the warrior and his son. But fear followed swiftly after. She ushered them inside and bolted the door. "They know," she whispered, setting down her parcels with trembling hands. Jonas saw you, or thinks he did. They're saying I've betrayed my own kind." The warrior's face darkened, his jaw tight. "Then I take my son." "You safe." Mary shook her head fiercely. "No, don't you see? It's too late for that. They already believe what they want to believe. If you leave now, they'll still condemn me. And Dakota." She looked down at the baby in her arms, her voice breaking. "He'll suffer without me." The warrior stepped closer, his presence filling the room with quiet strength. "Why risk your life for us? Your people hate mine. You owe nothing." Mary looked up at him, her eyes bright with fierce conviction. "Because it's the right thing. Because that baby needs me. And because—" She hesitated, her heart pounding as she whispered the words that had long lived unspoken in her chest. "Because I care for you both. More than I thought I could care for anyone again." The warrior's gaze softened, the hardness in his features melting away. He reached out slowly, almost uncertainly, and brushed his fingers against hers where they cradled a child. "I protect you," he said quietly, a vow more than a promise. "If danger come, they must go through me first." The firelight flickered between them, illuminating the bond that had grown from desperation into something far stronger. In that moment, Mary knew the truth. Her loyalties had shifted. She no longer belonged to the town that whispered against her. She belonged to this man and his child, to the fragile family they had created together. And though fear still lingered, she felt something stronger rising in its place: courage. Whatever the cost, she would stand by them. The snow deepened, laying a white silence over the prairie. Inside Mary's cabin, warmth flickered from the fire and laughter, soft, hesitant at first, began to thread through the nights. Dakota, now sturdier and more playful, had discovered the joy of grasping everything within reach. He tugged at Mary's hair, chewed on the warrior's beaded necklace, and squealed when either of them tried to pry it from his tiny hands. Mary's heart swelled each time she saw the child smile. But it wasn't only the baby who filled her heart. More and more, her eyes lingered on his father. She noticed the quiet way he observed the world, the gentleness in his hands when he held his son, the rare but warm sound of his laughter when Dakota did something mischievous. The stern lines of his face softened in those moments, revealing a man who carried not only strength, but deep tenderness. Their evenings had stretched longer now. Where once the warrior would leave quickly after the baby slept, he now lingered. He sat near the fire, listening as Mary told stories from the Bible or tales of her childhood by the river. In turn, he shared fragments of his world legends of the coyote, the songs of warriors, the prayers whispered to the rising sun. Though his English was broken, his meaning was never lost. Mary found herself leaning closer, hungry for his words, his presence. She began to look forward to each knock, not with fear, but with anticipation. One night, as Dakota gurgled happily on a blanket near the fire, Mary caught herself humming the meadowlark lullaby he had taught her. The warrior looked at her with quiet surprise, then nodded slowly. "You sing." "Like his mother," he said, his voice low. Mary's throat tightened. "I could never replace her." He studied her for a long moment, then shook his head gently. "No, but you are mother too." "He know." "I see it." Her chest ached at his words, but it was not sorrow, it was something deeper, warmer. She looked at Dakota, then back at the man who watched her with an intensity that both unsettled and steadied her. For a heartbeat, she let herself imagine it. The three of them, not divided by race or suspicion, but united as a family. The thought both frightened and thrilled her. Their bond deepened further as winter pressed hard against the door. The warrior began bringing firewood stacked neatly outside her cabin. Once, she returned from feeding the chickens to find the fence repaired, the latch on her barn strengthened. He did not speak of it, but she knew it was his way of caring for her, and she, in turn, began to cook more than enough for one. When she ladled stew into a bowl and pressed it into his hands, she no longer offered excuses. He ate without protest, his eyes softening as he accepted what she freely gave. One evening, Dakota took his first unsteady step between them, tottering from Mary's open arms to his father's waiting hands. Both of them laughed, the sound mingling in the small cabin, filling it with a joy that felt almost too big for its walls. The warrior lifted the boy high, pride blazing in his eyes, then lowered him into Mary's embrace. Their hands touched as they passed the child between them, and this time neither pulled away. For a moment, the world outside, the town's suspicion, the divide between their peoples seemed to vanish. Mary's gaze met his, and in that silence, she understood. What had begun as desperation had become something far greater. Love, fragile yet undeniable, had grown between them. It was a love the world would never accept. But within these walls, it was theirs. By late February, the snow began to soften, melting into small rivulets that trickled across the frozen earth. The air still carried a chill, but there was a whisper of spring on the wind. Inside Mary's cabin, life was stirring with more energy than ever before. Dakota, once so frail and weak, had blossomed into a lively little boy. His cheeks glowed with health, his legs sturdier each day. He no longer wanted to be carried constantly. Instead, he pulled himself up by gripping the edge of chairs or Mary's skirts, determined to test the strength of his small legs. Mary and the warrior watched him with equal parts pride and worry. Every wobble made her heart leap, but every stumble made her laugh. "He's got your stubbornness," she teased one evening, as Dakota clung to the table leg and refused to sit back down. The warrior gave a rare grin. "No," he replied. "Yours." Dakota's progress became their shared focus. Nights that had once been filled with wary conversation now rang with laughter as the boy toddled between them, falling, rising, and trying again. He would crawl quickly into Mary's lap, then turn and stretch his arms toward his father, demanding to be taken back. One night, the milestone they had both been waiting for arrived. Mary was seated near the fire, her hands outstretched, while the warrior crouched a few feet away. Dakota stood between them, swaying on chubby legs, eyes wide with both fear and excitement. "Come to me, little bird," Mary encouraged softly. Her heart fluttering, the warrior added in his tongue, a word Mary didn't know but could feel it was something like bravery. "Strength, forward." Dakota let out a squeal, then lifted one foot, then the other. His arms flailed, his balance teetered, but he moved one step, then another, before collapsing into Mary's waiting arms. She hugged him tight, tears welling in her eyes. "You did it, Dakota. You walked." The warrior's expression broke into radiant pride. He scooped the child up next, lifting him high toward the ceiling. "Strong boy," he said, voice rough but warm. Like his mother, like his mother's. The word lingered in the air. Mary felt her breath catch, heat rising in her chest. He had spoken it without hesitation, acknowledging her place beside him in the child's life. She dared not speak, afraid the moment would shatter, but her heart knew. He saw her not as a stranger, not as merely a helper, but as something far more. That night, they celebrated in small, quiet ways. Mary baked cornbread, slicing it thick and golden, and the warrior accepted his share with a grateful nod. They ate together at the table, Dakota babbling happily between them, as though sensing his own achievement deserved a feast. Later, when the child finally fell asleep, Mary lingered by the fire. The warrior sat across from her, Dakota's tiny moccasin still in his hands. His eyes softened as he studied the little shoes. "He will run soon," he said. "Run fast. Run free," Mary smiled, though her throat tightened. "Yes, And when he does, he'll need both of us to keep up." Their gazes met then, steady, unflinching. Something unspoken passed between them, something deeper than words. The bond forged over long nights of hunger, fear, and hope had grown root-strong. Living, undeniable. Outside, the snow continued to melt, carrying the promise of spring. But inside, something even greater had begun. The first steps not only of a child, but of a family. Spring arrived in earnest. The hillsides bloomed with wildflowers, and the air grew soft with birdsong. Mary found herself happier than she had been in years. The baby's laughter filled her days, and the warrior's quiet strength steadied her nights. Together, they had carved out something that felt like a family, fragile, unspoken but real. But peace could not last forever. One morning, Mary strapped Dakota to her back in a woven sling and walked to town for flour and lamp oil. She rarely went these days, not since whispers had begun to follow her, but supplies were low. The warrior had offered to bring firewood and meat, yet he never stepped into town with her. His people were not welcome there, and if Mary was honest, neither was she any more. The moment she entered the general store, silence fell. Conversations hushed, eyes shifted, and though no one spoke directly, Mary felt the weight of their stares. She kept her chin high, refusing to shrink, but her palms were damp against the handle of her basket. Mrs. Talbot, the baker's wife, eyed the child slung against Mary's back. "That's not your kin," she said sharply, her voice carrying to the rest of the room. Mary stiffened. "He's under my care." "Under your care?" one of the men muttered. "Looks more like you've gone and tied yourself to one of them." A ripple of murmurs passed through the room, words like savage, disgrace, unnatural. Mary felt her cheeks burn, but she would not let them see her falter. She turned to the counter, asked for her flour, and placed her coins down with a steady hand. Behind her, the voices grew louder. "What kind of woman nurses an Apache child?" Someone spat. "A woman who's forgotten her place." Mary clutched Dakota tighter. The baby stirred, sensing her tension, and whimpered softly. She bent her head over him, whispering comfort, but her own heart trembled. When she stepped outside, the sunlight blinded her. She thought the worst was over, but there on the edge of town, she saw him, the warrior, waiting just beyond the ridge, his horse tethered in the brush. He had not followed her into town, but he had not let her go alone either. Their eyes met across the distance, and relief flooded her chest. Yet others saw too. A young boy, running past, shouted, "She's meeting him! The squaw man!" By nightfall, the whole town would know. That evening, when she returned to her cabin, she told him everything, the whispers, the stares, the accusations. Her voice broke as she admitted, "They think I'm shamed, that I've betrayed my own people." The warrior listened in silence, his jaw set, his eyes dark with a fire she could not read. When she finished, he looked at her for a long time. Then simply he said, "You give life to my son. You are mother. That is honor, not shame." But Mary knew the town would not see it that way. Already, she could feel the walls closing in. She feared they would come to her door, demand she give up the child, maybe worse. Still, when Dakota reached for both of them, tugging at her sleeve with one hand and at his father's beaded necklace with the other, Mary knew one thing for certain: she would not abandon him. No matter what the town said, no matter what dangers loomed, the first judgment had fallen and more would come. But so too had a choice: to stand apart from the world she had known, or to fight for the family she had found. The rumors spread like wildfire. Within days, Mary could feel the shift whenever she set foot near town. Doors closed a little faster, conversations dropped to whispers, and children were pulled away from her path. Even those who had once shared coffee at her table now crossed the street rather than greet her. At first, she told herself she could endure it. Let them whisper. Let them glare. What mattered was Dakota's laughter, the warmth of his small hand curling around her finger, and the silent strength of the man who never failed to appear at her door each night. But the hostility grew bolder. One afternoon, a pair of men from town rode up to her cabin. They didn't dismount, but their message was clear. "You best send that child back where he belongs," one of them drawled, spitting into the dirt. "No sense raising a savage as your own." Mary stood tall in the doorway, Dakota clutched to her chest. "He is my child in every way that matters," she said firmly. The man's lip curled. "Not by blood," the other added. "You'll bring nothing but trouble on yourself. And maybe on all of us." They left with the warning hanging heavy in the air. That night, Mary told the warrior what had happened. His face darkened, and for a long while he stared into the fire without speaking. Finally, he said, "If I take him, danger less for you." The thought cut her like a blade. To send Dakota away after nursing him through sickness, after watching his first smile, his first steps felt like tearing out her own heart. "No," she whispered fiercely. "Don't you see? He isn't just yours anymore. He's ours." Their eyes met across the flickering firelight. She saw the weight of his struggle, the loyalty to his people, the fear for her safety. But beneath it all was something stronger. The same bond that tied her to Dakota also tied him to her dot the next day. Mary did something bold. She walked into town with Dakota in her arms and stood before the church steps, where the townsfolk gathered after Sunday service. Whispers rose immediately, but she lifted her chin and spoke so all could hear. "This child is not a burden, not a shame, not a threat," she declared. "He is a gift. I will not abandon him, nor will I be shamed for loving him. You may turn your backs on me if you must, but I will not turn my back on him." Her voice trembled, but her gaze did not waver. Behind her, unseen until that moment, the warrior stepped forward, Dakota's tiny moccasins in his hand. The crowd gasped, some stepping back in fear. Yet he stood tall, not with menace, but with dignity. For a long, heavy silence, no one spoke. Some faces hardened, others softened, but Mary understood then that their approval no longer mattered. She had made her choice. When she returned to the cabin that evening, she sat by the fire, Dakota asleep against her chest. The warrior sat close, their shoulders brushing. "You spoke strong," he said quietly. "Like eagle who defends her nest," Mary smiled, tears glistening in her eyes. "I only spoke the truth." In that moment, they both knew the road ahead would not be easy. The town might never accept them, danger might always linger, but within the walls of her little cabin, they had built something stronger than fear. They had chosen each other, and in that choice, a new family was born.